long time, but now I am ready. The AWA. From one major league of wrestling to the other, from the WWF.
Why people really hated Greg Valentine in real life isn't much of a mystery anymore. Between the sexist stuff he said, the legal messes he got into, and the way he acted around fans, it's no wonder he rubbed so many people the wrong way. And trust us, it's just as wild as you're probably imagining. So let's get into it. Let's start with one of the more talked about moments. Back in 2015, Greg Valentine appeared on a podcast and made comments that were, frankly, hard to believe in that day and age. While discussing women's wrestling, he said that if it were up to him, he'd fire every girl wrestler and send them all out to the strip bar. Just like that. No hesitation. Now, even in an industry that had historically mistreated its female performers, those words hit hard. Fans and wrestlers alike called him out for being outdated, sexist, and just flat-out disrespectful. It wasn't just a slip-up, it was a clear sign of how little respect he had for women in wrestling, and it left a sour taste in a lot of people's mouths. But sadly, that wasn't just a one-time thing. Greg's attitude toward others, especially women, was part of a bigger pattern. See, years before that podcast appearance, he was already involved in a much more serious situation, one that went way beyond words and landed him in real legal trouble. In 2008, Greg Valentine went to court to appeal emergency protective orders and domestic violence orders filed against him by his then-girlfriend, Kristen Horan. According to the documents, the court wasn't just dealing with a messy breakup. No, this went deeper. The records revealed that back in 2002, Valentine had already been convicted of assault in the 4th degree and 2 counts of sexual abuse in the 1st degree. Let that sink in. These weren't small claims or rumors. These were official, documented charges from years earlier that painted a disturbing picture of his private life. And while he tried to challenge the protective orders years later, those past convictions didn't just disappear. It's the kind of thing that makes you stop and think. Because while Greg Valentine kept showing up at wrestling conventions and doing interviews like any other retired legend, he had this serious legal shadow hanging over his legacy. A lot of fans didn't even know about it. But once people started digging deeper into his background, it became clear that this wasn't just a guy who said the wrong thing once or twice. He had a real history of dangerous behavior. Now you might think, okay, maybe that's where it ends. But no, there's more. One of the wildest stories Greg Valentine has ever told himself actually involves punching a fan. Yeah, really. According to Valentine, during a match, a fan jumped into the ring, or at least got close enough, and Greg straight up clocked him. That punch led to a lawsuit not just against Greg, but against the WWF as well. While it's easy to argue that a fan shouldn't be jumping into the action, the way Valentine talks about the incident makes it feel less like self-defense and more like he enjoyed it. And that's kind of the problem. He always seemed a little too proud of these violent or aggressive stories, like they were badges of honor. What makes it more concerning is that this wasn't the era of strict security and clearly drawn lines between wrestler and audience. Back then, things were chaotic. Wrestlers were supposed to protect the show, but sometimes that meant real punches, real danger, and real consequences. Greg Valentine, more than once, seemed to blur those lines way too much, and fans paid the price. Now, if that wasn't enough, let's talk about the issue that affected a lot of wrestlers from his generation: steroids. Greg Valentine has openly admitted that he used steroids during his career, especially at a time when the wrestling world barely regulated them. Now, to be fair, he wasn't alone. Plenty of guys were doing it. It was part of the job in the 80s and early 90s, when having a massive muscular body was almost expected. But what makes Greg's case interesting is how casually he speaks about it, like it was just another chapter in the book, without much reflection on what it might have done to his health, or the message it sent to younger wrestlers trying to break in. Steroid use on its own might not be a personal scandal anymore, especially with how common it was, but it does add to the picture of a man who didn't really seem to think about consequences, whether they were physical, emotional, or legal. It's just another piece of the puzzle that helps explain why so many people ended up disliking him. And speaking of dislike, Greg Valentine hasn't exactly kept his opinions to himself when it comes to other wrestlers either. Over the years, he's made several bitter and downright nasty comments about others in the business. For example, he's gone out of his way to insult Shawn Michaels, calling him names and questioning his toughness. Now, wrestlers throwing verbal jabs at each other isn't new, but when it gets personal, especially years after retiring, it just feels mean-spirited. Worse still, Valentine made some awful remarks about Brutus Beefcake's wife, using highly offensive language that crossed every line of decency. These weren't wrestling promos or kayfabe trash talk. These were real-life opinions being thrown out into the public, and they didn't do anything but stir up more hate. At a time when fans want to celebrate legends and remember the best of wrestling's past, comments like these made Valentine come across more like a bitter old man than a respected veteran. All right, now let's dive into his wrestling career too. Greg's journey into wrestling started in the early 1970s. Born into the business as the son of legendary wrestler Johnny Valentine, Greg had wrestling in his blood. After traveling with his dad around the Texas wrestling territories, he decided to take the plunge himself. He trained under the brutal and legendary Stu Hart in Calgary. Yes, the same guy who trained Bret Hart, Dynamite Kid, and many others. That training wasn't easy, but it gave Greg the kind of toughness that would define his in-ring style for decades. In the early part of his career, Greg wrestled under various names like Babyface Nelson and Johnny Fargo. He worked in smaller promotions like the NWF, where he teamed with Don Fargo in a tag team gimmick. But it wasn't long before he ditched the aliases and took on the name that would stick, Greg the Hammer Valentine. It was a tribute to his father, but it also worked perfectly with his heavy-handed, smash-mouth style of wrestling. He wasn't flashy. He was deliberate, mean, and methodical. By the mid-1970s, Greg had started making waves in Mid-Atlantic Championship Wrestling. This was a hot territory at the time, and Valentine fit right in. He had a strong feud with Johnny Weaver and eventually started teaming with a young Ric Flair. The two had great chemistry and won the NWA World Tag Team titles together. Greg's figure four leg lock became his signature move, and his ability to work long, hard-hitting matches earned him plenty of respect, even if he was usually the bad guy. Then came his big break. He moved up to the WWF, where the real spotlight was waiting. In 1984, he defeated Tito Santana to win the Intercontinental Championship. That victory cemented him as a top singles competitor. He had a strong run with the title and defended it at the very first WrestleMania in 1985, where he faced Junkyard Dog. Even though he lost the match by countout, he held onto the belt for a while longer before eventually losing it back to Santana. That IC title feud with Tito remains one of his most remembered rivalries. Not long after that, Greg shifted his focus to tag team wrestling again, this time with Brutus Beefcake. Together they formed the Dream Team, managed by Johnny Valiant. The pairing worked surprisingly well, and in 1985 they captured the WWF World Tag Team Championship by defeating the US Express. For a while they were one of the top teams in the company. Valentine's no-nonsense brawling mixed with Beefcake's showmanship made for a fun, dynamic duo. They eventually lost the belts at WrestleMania, 2 to the British Bulldogs, and soon after, the Dream Team fell apart. But Greg wasn't done teaming up. In the late 80s, he formed another memorable team, this time with the Honky Tonk Man. They called themselves Rhythm and Blues. If you thought Greg Valentine was all grit and toughness, this was a different side of him. He dyed his hair jet black, started dressing like a rock star, and even carried a guitar to the ring. It was campy, it was weird, but somehow it worked in that over-the-top WWF world. The team never won tag titles, but they were regulars on TV and pay-per-views and played their part in the entertainment-heavy direction the WWF was heading in. By the early 90s, Greg's time in WWF started winding down. He bounced around a bit, returning briefly to WCW and also working independent shows. In WCW, he had a short run with Terry Taylor, and the two even won the US Tag Team Championships together. But the spark just wasn't the same as it had been during his prime. Still, Greg stayed active in wrestling into the late 90s, making appearances here and there, sometimes in battle royals or nostalgic segments on TV. One of his final WWF appearances came in 2005 during a special Raw Homecoming event where he took part in a Legends Battle Royal. Even though he wasn't in his prime anymore, seeing him back on national television was a nice throwback for longtime fans. He also popped up occasionally at conventions and Hall of Fame ceremonies. still very much part of the old guard that helped build wrestling into what it became. Speaking of the Hall of Fame, Greg Valentine was inducted into the WWE Hall of Fame in 2004. Like it or not, his career accomplishments were hard to ignore. He held major titles, worked with some of the biggest names in the business, and remained a reliable performer for over 2 decades. He also got inducted into other wrestling halls of fame over the years, a sign of how deeply rooted he was in the history of the sport. Throughout his career, Valentine was known for his toughness. He didn't fly off the top rope. He didn't cut wild promos. He just beat people down, worked their legs, and locked in the figure 4 until they tapped or passed out. That was his style, and he stuck to it. Fans might not have cheered for him, but they respected the grind. So while his personal life brought him a lot of criticism, and rightfully so, his career inside the ring tells a different story. Greg Valentine was a throwback to a rougher, tougher era of professional wrestling. He didn't have the flash, but he had the fight. And whether he was teaming with Flair, Beefcake, or Honky Tonk, or going solo as a champion, he always brought a sense of seriousness to the ring. All right, that's a wrap for today's video. Make sure to hit that like button and subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next.